In this last section, we're going to focus primarily on cities. Once again, we look at that push-pull, right? So the urban areas can pull people in because there's the job opportunities and they can have access to more services and things like that. And in some ways, it actually can help protect biodiversity because we're not sprawling out quite as far. But on the flip side of that is the area that where we have a city, obviously not protecting the biodiversity very well in that particular area. One of the issues is that cities really can't be self-sustaining, especially as they start to get larger. They don't have all the resources that they need to be able to be self-sustaining. For example, here in Phoenix, while we don't necessarily have what you would typically think about the centers of poverty and crime like some of our bigger cities back east do, or in Los Angeles or places like that, but we are not self-sustaining. If we didn't bring in things into Phoenix, water and food and things like that, our city could not sustain itself. We have way too many inputs coming into our city that can't be generated here. And then on the flip side of that, there's a lot of things that come out of having large concentrations of people in areas, some of them positive, some of them negative. We've already talked about some of the negative things, but on the positive side, when you have cities and people close together like that, you tend to have more wealth and ideas and industry and things like that occur. It's just making those so that it can still be there, but have a lower impact. And that's where Curitiba and some other cities that are trying to be more sustainable are working on that. So one of the concerns about cities is noise. And we've all had those loud neighbors every once in a while, but when we look at like decibels that cause decibels of sound that cause damage, what's on the list here is after 8 hours. So it's after, like, if you were to listen to a lawnmower for 8 hours straight, that's where you would start to have some hearing damage. So you can kind of look at, so one of the ones that cracks me up is those boom cars, like those cars that, they're driving down the street and the car's like vibrating as it goes down the street. It's actually worse for you than an air raid siren. Because that lower decibel and causing the issues. So just some different things that are on the list. Some of the things that you might be exposed to, others probably not, like a military rifle. Not many of us are exposed to that. But once again, this is sustained use for 8 hours, or being exposed to it for 8 hours. So poverty, we've talked about. Population and poverty are our two main sources of environmental problems. When we have people that feel that pull to come to the city because there are hopes that there are jobs there, and then there aren't, they generally don't leave again. They don't really have any place to go, and that's where things like shanty towns start to pop up outside the city center. So you can see here's high-rise, probably apartment buildings in the area, and then right outside of the city you have people who just threw together houses with whatever they could. They don't have running water, they don't have sewers or plumbing or anything like that, and the services, nobody's coming and picking up their trash and all of that. And so you tend to have areas of extreme poverty right outside city centers, that the problems from, I hate to tell people, but the problems from shanty towns don't just stay in shanty towns. And that's where the issues that come from that, where you have a high population of people who don't have enough to survive on, and they see people who do, they're going to go that direction. And so, and they're going to try to go to the places where they do have running water and things like that they can use to survive. When we look at our land availability, once again, we talk about what influences urban development. We said one of those things was having land where we can actually move out and spread out is what will cause urban sprawl. And so we've started to increase the amount of urban transportation or mass transit here in the Phoenix area, it's nowhere near where it needs to be to reduce the reliance of people who live in Phoenix on their cars. It's just not. In lots of areas, we don't have enough mass transit that has good schedules and is reliable enough for people to really reduce their use of their personal cars. So we hold on to our cars because that's, it's independence, as we can go where we want, when we want, and all of that. But we all know that there's some downsides to having vehicles as well. Some alternatives to driving your vehicles, obviously. We don't have subways here. We're starting to have light rail and trains. We have some buses, particularly within the city. If you live in one of the outlying areas, that's where it gets a little tougher. And when you do live further away from where you work or go to school, walking and biking might not be an ideal source. When I used to work up at Boulder Creek, I lived about 17 miles away from Boulder Creek, and there was no way. I lived down I-17. I was not riding my bike up I-17. So sometimes it's the where do we live versus where do we work, and whether it's practical or not to use those alternative modes of transportation. Obviously, for all of our different modes, there's some advantages and disadvantages. The mass transit and like the light rail is what we're starting to put in down in Phoenix, and it's come up to Dunlap now, that you can take down into the city center. As the schedules as they run trains more frequently, people will start to use it more. We have our buses that are cheaper to run on the light rail, easier to divert around, makes them a little bit more flexible, easier to add on more of them during high need times. Rapid rail we don't have here in the Phoenix area. They have rapid rail back east, and this is where you have places that are a little bit further apart, and so these are the high-speed trains. You hear about them in Europe sometimes. For the most part, they're really safe. You really only hear about them, unfortunately, when there's an accident, but that doesn't happen very often. One of the ideas or one of the possibilities is to look for some ways that we can add in some of these high-speed routes using some of the rail lines that already exist, or maybe updating some of those rail lines. So here are some proposed areas where they thought it would be beneficial, and so we could cut down some air traffic and car traffic. When we look at land use planning, we're really trying to look at now, kind of looking backwards at it, how could we have been a little bit smarter about our planning to try to reduce some of the sprawl and to encourage patterns that have people a little bit closer to where they need to be, where they live, closer to where they work, closer to where they raise their food and things like that. So we look at some of those smart growth tools. We have carrots and sticks, basically. So we have the carrot, which is the tax breaks and incentives, and trying to use some good planning and trying to encourage people to use some of these smarter growth tools. And then we have the more of the stick, which is the laws and regulations, which say that you have to do this, and if you don't, then there's fines. But really trying to educate people about why these are good and how this is actually going to be beneficial to the people who live in that area. So one of the things about being an eco-city is having the kind of village effect. In Anthem, this was one of the ways, and Verrado is another one of them. This was really the way that they thought when they started to build these things, about having an area there where you have your main shopping area, and then you kind of have little mainline spokes that go out from there, where you have the school and you have grocery stores and things like that are closer to where people actually needed to be. And so looking at having different densities of housing, in addition to having some urban centers around, as part of that cluster development. And so when we look at the land, it's also about looking at how do we incorporate what was naturally there into our plan. So the old way that we've done things is like this. So we went from the open area, we actually covered everything up, drained the marsh, divert the creek, put in drainage, and then we just pave over everything and we put it in our houses. We have different densities of housing, and so we can have different prices of different houses and things like that. But the more sustainable way in looking at cluster development is to work with the land and to put in lower density housing. You still have some that are closer together. You're still going to have your variety of prices of homes, where you have homes on bigger pieces of land and things like that, and those on smaller. But it's about how do we put those in areas where we can still have like a park area, so they can have a parking lot here, you can come, you can enjoy the natural environment in those areas. We can have some higher density housing, looks like some apartments in some areas, you might have some stores and things like that, but to make it really fit in more integrally with land, as opposed to just paving it all over, which is really where the eco-city concept comes from, and where we look at how do we incorporate so that everything is as close as possible, and so that we don't have to use as much fossil fuels in order to move either goods or people around. So we're looking at cities that are built for people, not around cars. So we look at those developments that really focus on community and the structure of the community, as well as lower impact on the environment. So using renewable energy sources like solar power, and using the wetlands for wastewater treatment and things like that, using recycled water, using our energy efficiency. We're starting to see some of this now where, you know, we're trying to convert over, and you see like all these rooftops and the shade structures and parking lots and all of that being covered in solar panels is a move towards, you know, that shift towards sustainable energy. Part of the EcoCity concept is also that protecting biodiversity. If you have an area that looks like this versus an area that looks like this, you're going to protect more of your biodiversity here in this area. You're going to protect that natural habitat of the pond and the stream, those riparian areas, for the animals that were there before and the organisms that were there before. And they use the zoning to do that. So they say that you can't build that this close to the water area. We're going to zone this for a park. We're going to zone this for a different area. And having places like where you can have urban gardens, where there would be a place in here for that, and there's really not a place for that in here. So making sure that we keep areas open for those kind of purposes.